Hello. Hello. I'm going to sing. Boy, you're a rowdy bunch. I don't do tricks up here. I could sing, but you'd probably all leave, and then Dr. Wheat here would be very sad, and she's drove a long ways to come see us. Anyway, I'm Roxanne. If you're on Facebook, I'm that lady on Mondays that does the little live streaming introductions. But a couple things I want to talk about before we get started. As you know, this Saturday we're having our gala. And I know Tim is normally here to do this introduction, but he's in the room over next door and they're tasting wine, so I'm not sure what shape he'll be in when he comes back. But the gala is Saturday night. If you haven't seen any information about it, we have flyers out. We've got a really great lineup coming, so hope to see you there. If you are new to Great Decisions, we still have our books left. They're $15, and you can get them down at the desk, or if you have exact change, you can get it from me tonight. But they're really great to use, and as you know, we're archiving the presentation, so later in the year, you can look at your book and watch what you hear here. So anyway, I want to thank everybody. This is the first year I've done this, so I'm really happy that you're all here and smiling and asking really good questions. So, and then here's the fun part. I get to introduce the introducer who's going to introduce the introducer, and then finally someone's going to talk about our nice presenter. So anyway, where's Connie? Connie wants to talk. And then after Connie, it's Linda.
I'll be short. Thank you. Very briefly, the League of Women Voters is having a candidates forum for the county executive position, which I think is going to be pretty interesting this year. And it's going to take place at 7 o'clock on Thursday, March 15th, and it will be in the council chambers of Manitowoc City Hall. And as I look around the room, a lot of the faces that I usually see at the candidates forum are in this room. So please remember to show up for ours too. Thank you. Linda, next.
I like to have a podium in front of me that I can set my piece of paper down. Elizabeth is an assistant professor in public and environmental policy affairs, and political science at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay. You know that already. It says so on the screen. She's originally from Marshall, Michigan. That's not on the screen. She earned her master's degree in public affairs with an emphasis in comparative environmental policy from Indiana University, and completed her doctorate in political science at Western Michigan University. She teaches courses in a wide range of things: global politics, environmental law and policy, natural resources, the presidency, international law and policy, and environmental justice. And in most of her courses, students participate in mock trials, model United Nations simulations, and environmental policy debates. And in case you wonder if she has human activities, she's also a proud dog mama to 4 pups and 2 cats, including a Siamese named CLAW''D. Think about it, Monet. She revealed this information in print, so I know it's accurate. She's been at Green Bay since July of 2012. She also spoke in a last lecture series at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, and I would really like to have heard that. Is there a copy online? In that case. Okay.
Should be good to go on sound? Sounds all right, yes. Thank you for choosing me over the wine. I understand it's probably a tough competition of foreign policy versus wine next door, so thank you very much for being here. I spoke in this series a few years ago and really enjoyed it, and so I'm excited to be back on a bit of a different topic this time. So I'll be talking about the media and foreign policy section. And this I wanted to bring up. This is what they call a word cloud. And in order to develop this, they took the topics from one of the largest international studies conferences. And so these are the popular topics that were discussed about a year ago at the conference. And so you can see obviously foreign is a big one. It's an International Studies Association, policy, relations. Some of the teeny ones, you have Arab, you have challenges, change. China was a big topic about a year ago. And I was curious, what are some of the, if someone's asking you, when you think of foreign policy, what are some of the words that you would put in your word cloud? Russia, Korea, yep. What else? Syria. Trump. Chaos, yeah. Especially in the last couple of days. It's a bit hard to keep up on news. Tariffs. We're hearing a lot of debates right now over what sort of tariff policy. Paul Ryan has actually come out a couple of hours ago disagreeing with President Trump, which is very rare to see. Yeah, so it's constantly changing. These are really neat tools. I do this with my students every once in a while, where I will ask them to give me different words just to get associations and put them up so they can really see what are some of the important issues that come up. I'm going to start talking a little bit with looking at the global media. What we know is that there's a big concentration of global ownership. So nearly 20% of all global ad spending is from a few companies. So this means, and they're going to have subsidiaries underneath them, but a few companies are controlling a good chunk of the global market. Okay, and we'll look at the U.S. In a little bit on that, but in the US, we have 6 corporations that are going to control about 90% of the media. Okay, so we have a really small number that's dictating the content that we see. Okay, and so if you're curious, Comcast is the largest. Get a bit of feedback on this. Disney is going to be the second largest. And then we have News Corp, which will include Fox and a few others. And then Time Warner is the 4th largest. Okay, so Comcast, we tend to know if you have cable. Comcast is very likely one of your providers. But again, small number of news outlets. And one of the challenges that we see a bit more internationally, and we'll come back to this in a few slides, is this issue of suppression. With our media, we don't really have that, right? We have a lot of, it's controlled by a small number, but we don't have the content necessarily suppressed. When you're looking at countries, particularly Russia, China, and Turkey are the 3 that are mentioned in there. With Russia, there's a lot of national networks, okay? So the Kremlin is directly dictating content. And the corporations that are not run by the government are strongly influenced by government content as well. So very close ties. And so what that means is for freedom of expression, almost non-existent in Russia. And so just the idea of being able to disagree with government's decisions is not a privilege that you're going to have in most Russian media outlets. With China, China is one of the most aggressive on blocking access to websites. So there's internet access, but they won't be able to access Facebook or Wikipedia or YouTube or a lot of the sites that we're used to accessing regularly. Okay, and they'll also put a bunch of firewalls up, so essentially blocking Chinese citizens from accessing the content. Turkey, this has really changed in the last couple of years. There was a failed coup in 2016, and since then, you see quite the crackdown on independent media, almost to the point that the Turkish citizens are able to get very little information on what their own government is doing. Okay. Globally, we also have a big challenge with either tolerance or intolerance of dissent, that it's very difficult to disagree with the government. And I'll use Turkey as an example there as well. Turkey will prosecute and jail journalists on a whole host of bogus charges. And it's not the kind of place you want to hang out in a Turkish prison. So if you insult an official, you can very easily be jailed for that. Okay, that's not the tolerance for disagreement. In addition to possible physical attacks as well. With the state censorship and control of content, this can be control of the media content that comes out on television, websites that can be accessed. And so China is ranked last in the world by Freedom House, which will look at essentially media rankings of how free a media system is. Okay, so China is the least free in the world. They can also do other options such as closing the outlets, so whether it's shutting down the company, closing the websites, really limiting the kinds of information and the viewpoints that citizens are exposed to. But I think one of the alarming trends, and I'll show you some charts in a bit, are the pressures we're seeing on journalists. That if you watch CNN or NBC, you've probably seen Richard Engel. I think he's one of the more famous journalists, or Christiane Amanpour, when she used to do more international travel. Incredibly dangerous work on a good day. And we're starting to see a trend where there's quite a few attacks on journalists, and also being jailed. And so when you add that to changing the kind of access they get, it's a little bit disturbing. This is from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the dark red that you see up top are cases where we know the motive. So whether the motive was murder or the motive was political dissent, whatever the cause of the attack was. And then the lighter pink ones are motive suspected, okay? Since 1982, 821 journalists have been killed. This chart will include just under 2,000, but 821 is kind of our main number. And it says 2 killed up here in 2018. It's actually closer to 8 when you include crossfire and combat. Okay. And so that includes Syria, Yemen, Mexico, Slovakia, Brazil, and Guatemala. And so journalists are putting themselves not only in dangerous situations, but also in situations where when they disagree with the government, but it's a very steep cost to pay. Okay. Coming stateside, we have a different view and a different media system, thankfully, much more open, and that will kind of come to some of the challenges with that. But if you look at the partisan breakdown, 71% of Democrats think that a spread of inaccurate information on the internet's a problem, and 76% of Republicans. Now, in these days, for the two parties to almost agree on anything is pretty exciting, right? And we've all heard the fake news lingo that was not really in our vernacular until a couple of years ago. And so overall, both parties agree that inaccurate information is a challenge. Okay? Democrats have been hurt by it, Republicans have been hurt by it. There's simply more inaccurate information out there. But we also primarily agree that our media plays a key role in our democracy. Okay? And with this, about 84% of those surveyed believe that media is critical to democracy. And a lot of, in terms of communicating information, engaging citizens to vote and participate. 43% believe that media supports democracy poorly. So think about that for a second. They feel it's very important, but that it supports democracy poorly. So basically, we can do better. We believe it's important, but the way we're doing our media now is simply not working well. Okay? Again, both parties are going to see the spread of this. Get this nearly 80% for both of them. And then we get into some of the bipartisan skepticism. And I'm not a big stats person, so I will not go into the algorithms on this. The long and short version is that these websites can weigh the content. So if something gets a lot of clicks or a lot of likes on Facebook, you're more likely to see that. And you may have heard Facebook's change so that you will see more from your friends and family and less from news and less from advertisements. That's all part of the algorithm that they use to shape the content you see. Okay? But there's a lot of skepticism on that. Okay? So about 60% believe that these major outlets use the algorithms to change the content. Okay, and there are concerns for democracy on that. Quite honestly, they all use it to change content. Everybody's going to have an algorithm. Okay, Twitter never used to, and then they added that as well. So if you follow a lot of conservatives, you're going to see more conservative information in your feed. If you follow a lot of Democrats, you're going to see more Democrats in your feed. Okay, so it will weigh that content a bit for you. And this one I found encouraging because it's really what I encourage my students to do. 71% of Americans surveyed say they get a mix of liberal and conservative views. And that for me is really important as an educator teaching political science. That I'm very open with my students on my partisanship and my experiences, but also make it very clear that you can be Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Republican. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're participating and that you're informed. And however you choose to do that, whoever you sign that ballot for at the end, I care most that you vote. Okay? And so this I found encouraging to see that there really was that push to get multiple perspectives. And it was a very small portion of those surveyed that said they only get information from a liberal source or they only get information from a conservative source. Okay, so the idea that the media is only giving us liberal views doesn't really pan out too much based on this particular Gallup survey on that one. This will look at media accuracy, and in case it's hard to see in the back, it says, in general, do you think news organizations get the facts straight? For news news organizations' stories and reports are often inaccurate. So the bright green line is showing that you believe they get the facts straight. So you can see that's gone down quite a bit over time. And then the darker green is the often inaccurate. Okay, really, really high. The peak that you're seeing right here is the 2000 election, when the exit polls were wrong. Depending on when you went to bed on the night of the election, you probably went to bed thinking Gore was the president. Okay. And you probably didn't see the embarrassing retractions that everyone had to give around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay. So that's where we see that big spike. But this is a big challenge with time pressures. And we'll get to some of the social media in a bit. But the idea that you can tweet something and it's instantly out there. No longer the days where someone is typing it in a newsroom, laying out the pieces and having to send it off to print, distribute the paper, and it's days later. It's instant now. Okay? Something happens, we know instantly. And so when there's a mistake, how many of us are going to see that retraction for the same story we saw the first time? And there's such a pressure to be the first one out and the first media outlet to report it, that there's simply a bigger challenge on all types of journalism to get the facts straight. Okay? And so the pace of it, I think, has certainly influenced some of the accuracy. For partisan perceptions, the question here is, which comes closer to your opinion? That the news media generally favors one political party over the other, or that the news media generally favors neither party? That bright green line is going to be favors one party, and then the dark green is that it favors neither. Okay. Note that this one does not separate it out by partisan. So it's not asking if it favors Democrats. Okay, it's just asking if it favors. But 62% feel that it's favoring one party. Okay. And we've seen this kind of change a little bit as party polarization has increased. That people are simply more sensitive to news that they disagree with. Okay, that there's more of an instant reaction to it. Okay, if you're a liberal, you're probably more liberal now. If you're a conservative, you're probably more conservative now, while at the same time independents are growing. Okay, and so we really see an interesting mix of ideology. Now, when you do break this down by party, 77% of Republicans felt that the media favored one party, and this is up almost double from what it was 15 years ago. So more Republicans are feeling that the media favors one party. In contrast, there's been no change among the Democrats feeling it favors a party. So only about 44% of Democrats feel that it favors a party. Okay, so no change there. So Republicans are feeling more pressure, more of a bias over time. For media favoritism, this one, more Americans, it's asking, which political party do you think the media generally favors? 64% will say it favors Democrats. Okay. And so if you think of the narrative that we're hearing from the Trump administration on the liberal media and the fake news, it really is feeding into this narrative, right? That a lot of Republicans are starting to feel that it does favor Democrats. Okay. It was about 88% of Republicans who believe the media is biased. They will say it favors Democrats. Okay. Democrats were actually split on who they felt the media favored. About half felt they favored Democrats and about half felt they favored Republicans. So we're seeing very different partisan perceptions on that. How many of you are on Twitter? Or ever looked at Twitter? Okay. A few? Okay. We're seeing, and the reason I ask, we're seeing a really different demographic on it. It's now become a really big trend in academia. So when I go to a political science conference, people are tweeting the sessions. Okay. And that used to be something that was much more for my college students. Not that I'm ancient, but it was much more of a younger social media. And now we're seeing that age span really change. And with our current administration, we've never seen we've never seen a president like this. We really haven't seen Twitter like this. And so I read too many of these when putting this presentation together. It's hard to pick. And so I pulled a few out that I think were recent highlights and tried to stay more on the media focus. So you see on the top, mainstream media in the US is being mocked all over the world. They've gone crazy. No substance there, it's just a media rant at some early hour morning. Strong feelings on CNN and MSNBC. So second one, bad ratings. Got scammed when they covered the anti-Trump Russia rally wall to wall. They probably knew it was fake news, but because it was a rally against me, they pushed it hard anyway. 2 really dishonest newscasters, but the public is wise. So you see an appeal to public intelligence, so people feel that, oh, I'm smarter than the news people, right? So it's a persuasive public opinion on that, and it again feeds into that narrative of concern that the media is liberal. Then we get, I've been much tougher on Russia than Obama. Just look at the facts. Total fake news. As an editing aside, fake news should not be capitalized. I'd mark them down on my student papers. And then the last one, we'll soon be heading to Switzerland to tell the world how great America is and is doing. Grammar issues there too. Our economy is now booming, and with all I am doing will only get better. Our country is finally winning again. As a general diplomacy, you don't go to an international summit to talk about how great you are. Just sort of a diplomatic norm on that one. And so with these are just a few examples. We've never seen a president engage with social media like this. And we've never seen some of the kinds of things that we might all think. Now, we're not the leader of the free world, unless you're secretly the president, in which case we'll have a talk afterwards at the wine party. But, you know, it's just a new level of political behavior and a very different kind of behavior. And so the question when we look at these, are these policy? Are these legal statements? Okay. And if any of you have read Fire and Fury, or have listened to interviews on the administration, it's a very unique communication style with this group. And so the transgender ban is one example where that was tweeted out and the advisors didn't know the president was going to say that. He just tweeted it out. And so as the legal process moves forward, there's going to be a lot of questions and really combing through what has been put on Twitter and whether or not that constitutes official US policy. And so when we get into the foreign policy area, these are big questions. That some of the comments and characterizations of world leaders we've not heard a president say before. And then we get to that factual issue where a lot of the tweets are inaccurate. They really play into stereotypes and areas of ignorance that people might not know about, okay? When I looked, as of this morning, Washington Post, as do most of the papers, have a fact-checking division. Since taking office, Trump has made 2,436 false or misleading claims, which for those of you playing at home, averages out to about 6 a day. Okay. And so it's important, these are not issues of Republican belief. These are issues of fact that are later proven to be inaccurate. Okay? We can have a reasonable debate over Republican policy and Democrat policy. But when you have factual inaccuracies that get tweeted by the leader of your country, that's problematic. Shifting gears a bit to looking at the international use of social media. This has become a powerful tool for both terrorism and propaganda. You may have heard of the book Jihad Academy. This was written by a gentleman who was a journalist it's a book from 2015, and he had been taken hostage by ISIS. And so he was hostage for about a year, and writes about the process of Islamic radicalism and sort of what he observed during that point in time. And is focusing largely on Syria. And what he really discusses is after the Iraq invasion in 2003, a lot of individuals become radicalized. There was a lot of controversy and backlash towards the West. And then frustration when the US doesn't step in to Syria a few years later. Okay. And so when you compound that with socioeconomic challenges and just the innate sense of belonging and wanting to do something that matters and having a purpose, ISIS was able to make a very persuasive appeal, and through social media you don't have to go anywhere other than your computer or your cell phone. Okay? And so with the recruitment and communications, you can see through Twitter, there's encrypted messaging. YouTube used to be a common tool until it essentially became too public, and then things kind of shifted to the dark web, which I really only know about from TV shows, so don't ask me dark web questions. But it's basically more difficult to detect now, okay? So it's not as open for some of the recruitment. But all of both ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban have been able to use these kinds of communications. And so they can create different cells all over the world. And so when there's a terrorist attack, we used to look if the attacker was part of an organization. Had they traveled to Libya? Had they traveled to Yemen? Now we're looking at their browser history. Okay? Because you can have what's essentially called a virtual coach. And basically it's your terrorism mentor, and coaching you through how to design whatever incendiary device you're using, whatever your recruitment strategy is, where to access supplies, and you can do it all from the comfort of your couch. You don't need to go anywhere. And so that's really expanded the reach, and it's helped these groups romanticize what it's like to be a terrorist. Okay, so they're able to do quite a bit more. When we look at event coverage, this is also going to shape what we know and what we think about the organizations. That after 9/11, we see, first of all, the attack was timed so that it would be peak media coverage. I was in college, I always watched the Today Show in the morning, and happened to see the first plane hit, and then I watched the second one go in, knowing that two of my best friends were a few blocks away. Okay, and I'm sure we all have our 9/11 stories from that day. It was timed to be at the peak media hour in the morning, so it would get maximum coverage in the city everyone in the world watches. Okay. After 9/11, the coverage of terrorist attacks has gone up over 50%. We're simply more aware of it and following it more. So with London and Manchester, 22 were killed, 116 injured. The attacker was born in England, family was Libyan, and they, we heard a lot of coverage on that one, right? London stopped sharing information with the US after a few media leaks. Pictures of the site and of some of the bodies were shown, and London and Interpol didn't take kindly to that, and so stopped sharing information with the US. But we heard a lot about that with both Nice and Paris. Nice was the one where the individual drove the vehicle into the crowd, and Paris was the direct attack on journalists. 17 killed in Paris, 12 were journalists. But at the same time the Paris attack happened, more than 2,000 people were killed in Nigeria, mostly women and children. How many of us saw that on TV? The media coverage of events, completely different. And in Nigeria, 2 of the suicide bombers were children. So this one, we'll look at how skewed our attack is of terrorism coverage. Okay? It's from a database that's looking at a little over 40,000 attacks from 1968 to 2009. And long story short, the author creates a statistical model with about 31 countries and looks at different factors that make it more or less likely for us to see coverage. So for example, Saudi Arabia is at the top. Saudi Arabia's index is going to be 10.2, which means that an attack in Saudi Arabia is 10.2 times more likely to be covered. It would be considered newsworthy as an attack of the same size somewhere else. And so when you look up top, Saudi Arabia is also a key ally of the US, and many of the attacks there are on Westerners. So we're hearing more about it. Okay? And then you get Israel and Italy, both strong interests, the UK. And with a lot of the attacks on the West, the death toll is usually lower, but the coverage is higher. Okay, so we're hearing more about certain attacks and not necessarily others. The author has a theory on why Colombia is at the bottom. Part of it is the violence has been going on so long that it's not really it's a new media story anymore. And so still horrific, just we're not hearing about it. Okay. This one I was really surprised when it came about. We are looking at basically the higher the GDP, the more likely we are to hear about an attack in that country, controlling for size and everything else. Okay? And so one author calls this the empathy gap, that are we more empathetic to countries that are like us or allies of us or something along those lines, okay? Give you a sense of some of the different types of social media. How many of you are on Facebook? Pretty good crowd. How many, okay, we covered Twitter. How many of you use Instagram? A little bit smaller on that one. I will say Instagram, it's for more than food. If you're a national park person, the national park accounts are fantastic to follow. Also, a lot of politicians and members of state have started to use it as well. So one example of the C40, which is a group of mayors from around the world, they're basically working on implementing the Paris Agreement. They'll post pictures of their meetings and of cool initiatives that they're doing. So Instagram is moving into that policy area. And how many of you have heard of WhatsApp before? Wow, that's the biggest one. I'm surprised on that. I had never heard about it till a few years ago, and it's used for international friends when we're all at the same conference, because we can message each other and it doesn't matter what server we're on, so you don't have to have an iPhone or texting. It's really more of a messaging service. Most of these come about in the late 2000s. Instagram is the most recent with 2010. So we have a lot of different types of social media and different ways of communicating that type of information. And they're all going to be used in policy and media coverage in some way. I did not put Snapchat on here, but I will say Russ Feingold is the first politician that I remember seeing who regularly posted snaps during his campaign. And so it really, my students loved it. It was a really neat marketing tool. I don't know how much it's taken off with other politicians on that one. I know you had a speaker last week, I believe, talking about Russia. But since the chapter in the book covers this, I wanted to highlight a few things. It's really important to look at how Russia acts both internationally and within its own country. And so looking at within Russia itself, they are very aggressive with suppressing protests and public dissent by journalists. And we get into some of the assassination issues as well. They have convicted some individuals of some of the more high-profile assassinations. But there've been state laws that have been passed in Russia making it much easier to prosecute journalists and to jail them with minimal to no due process. Okay. And so the journalists can be targeted with false charges and then receive prison sentences for those. Okay. With the Freedom House scores, they are, overall, their status is not free. And with each of these categories, the number on the bottom is the worst. So 83 out of 100, so 83% basically, for press freedom. They're towards the bottom for legal environment, with 30 being the lowest. 34 out of 40 for the political environment. 24 out of 30 for economic environment. And then again, overall, not considered to have a free press. In country, they're actively engaged in website suppression, particularly websites that would disagree with the government. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the national news is dictated by the Kremlin. So there's very little political debate. So when you have the recent Putin presentation where Florida gets nuked, there was no other discussion really in Russia of how the US felt about that. And so Russia can really shape the narrative on what Russian citizens think about the US and the kinds of beliefs that they're exposed to. Now, within the US, gets a little more lively. We have what the book calls troll farms. Which I have friends, some nieces, friends who have young children. I think of the trolls with funny hair, not that kind of troll. Yeah, they don't sing. With these troll farms, you're really looking at individuals or companies or whoever that are spreading paid ads, okay, and fake profiles. And they use that to then spread false and inaccurate information. So actually spreading fake news. Okay, and so they can create these, they're very difficult to detect, and the sheer volume makes it even difficult to crack down on them. Okay. With social media, part of what led Facebook's decision to change that algorithm was discovery of how many fake accounts there were and how much the news was manipulated. And so a lot of those false stories, again, that misinformation. Same with Google advertising. Google went a little more emotional. So when you go to Google, you'll see ads along the side or along the top, right? And Russia was able to shape the ads that you saw. And so in certain markets, they would basically stir up more anti-immigrant sentiment or stir up more racial tensions. They could really profile areas well and stir up a lot of that, it's anti-Semitism, again, racist views, white supremacist views, you name it. They can shape that, and we know the power of advertising. Okay, and so that's going to have a big impact on what goes forward. YouTube channels, same deal here. You can create accounts, fake news on that. With botnet spamming, you're creating, again, those fake accounts. And what they would do with those is create accounts. So they might say, you're an undecided Republican voter in the Midwest, because it was a really key demographic for this last election. And so when undecided Republican voter in the Midwest starts tweeting things, that can influence a campaign strategy, that can influence the kinds of news articles that come out in that area, and it really has an impact on the election. Now, overall, we don't know if all of the interference dictated the outcome. Okay? And that's something to be cautious of. We know it had an impact. We know people were influenced. We don't know if it handed Trump the win. Okay, we don't. And that's part of the Mueller investigation, and hopefully other agencies as well, to really see how that shaped it. It was less than 80,000 votes in 3 key swing states, including ours, though, that decided the election. So we can suspect that it influenced it, but as someone really wanting the data, we don't have the conclusive data showing that Russian interference changed the outcome. Okay? We might get it eventually, we don't have it yet. With digital foreign policy, this is one of the coolest areas that's been developing. And I'm betting if you go to some of the international diplomacy schools now, you're probably going to start getting a course in this soon. And so with this kind of, you mentioned the algorithms a little bit earlier, but the Twiplomacy, which I put the website up there, is a really, really neat site I recommend checking out. You can go through and find out the social media accounts of all sorts of world leaders and organizations. So like the World Trade Organization, the King of Saudi Arabia, who, interestingly enough, is the most influential world leader, and he averages about 213,000 retweets. So when he tweets something, it gets retweeted that many times. Trump is second at 79,000. So about a third of the coverage. The King of Saudi Arabia. Okay. And so that's going to influence perceptions of diplomacy when you have your leader of state creating these accounts. It's also going to cause a lot of policy and governing challenges. Are tweets official diplomatic correspondence? If you're at the UN and a leader calls someone else Rocket Man, does he mean it? What does that mean when they have to step into the negotiating room a few hours later and talk about nuclear weapons? And so this really can have a big impact. And for diplomacy, it doesn't move fast, and that's on purpose. It's supposed to be deliberative. It's supposed to be done by trained individuals who have experience in negotiation, which we used to have till a couple years ago. Now we have executives and governors of states. But back in the day when we had people with experience for the jobs that they had, then it was different, right? And so these kinds of impacts and changes in staffing decisions really matter. So it's become more reactive and less thoughtful in a lot of situations. Okay? But the advantage, you can reach more people quickly. Unless you're a super nerd, how many of you go to the UN website and read the news every day? No kindred spirits? No? All right, that's okay. I own it, it's fine. So, you can access that. I tell my students, you can go and read what the King of Saudi Arabia thought this morning on Twitter. So the access about it, and I think the democratic potential is there, just has some challenges. So what do we see social media being used for? It can help organize revolutions. Okay. If you watched the Arab Spring, and the protests in the square, it was really powerful to see that many hundreds of people. We could watch that from our homes in Wisconsin, thousands of miles away, okay? And so we get real-time information. It's free, right? I mean, other than your internet service that you're paying for. And your participation, you don't have to be there for us. So we can feel more of a sense of solidarity and support just by watching that. In looking at Russia and the Ukraine, social media has been used to track troop movements. So what someone can tweet or post where troops are located, the risk there is always going to be misinformation. That if you make your strategy decisions based on a tweet, then there could be a big problem with that. YouTube tutorials, how to protest, how to gain support. And if you watch the kids in Parkland right now, you can bet they're learning this very quickly. In about 2 weeks, we've seen more discussion on gun control than we've seen in decades. Okay? And it's certainly up for debate on kind of what the issues are, but we've never really seen teenagers, since probably the civil rights movement, mobilize like this. Okay? They can't vote yet. And they're active, and they've watched this, and they understand the process better than a lot of my students do. Okay. And it's powerful to see that. And they can use social media to say, hey, we're going to organize this march on DC. We're going to do a lie-in in front of the White House to represent each student that was killed in that shooting. Okay. And they don't have to pay for any commercials. They don't have to do any crazy marketing campaign. They just have to post a tweet or a Facebook event. Okay. With the downside, we call it liberation technology. And the optimistic part of me would say this is a really powerful tool for democracy, right? More people can participate, learn about it. But the problem is, it's not really making the movements overall more effective. Okay? And the challenge is, you might hear language clicktivist, kind of a spin on activist. And this idea that if you can just click on something, click on that like or attend that event, that you feel you've participated and you're not in it for the long term. Okay? Because you don't develop that solidarity, you don't necessarily develop the trust with the group. And so you can feel you're making a difference temporarily, when in the long run you didn't really go all in for the movement. Okay? And so kind of a downside where it makes people feel they participated, but they really just clicked on a link. Okay? One of the most powerful knowledge sharing moments that I can think of was when the Ferguson, Missouri protests were happening. Okay? It was not covered initially by any major news outlet. I watched it on, I think, Democracy Now! On Facebook. Okay? But what you saw were individuals in Palestine tweeting to the protesters in Ferguson about how to survive the police tear gas. You saw it in Standing Rock too. Okay? That these are individuals thousands of miles away saying, hey, we have the knowledge to understand what you're going through for the first time. So we're going to tell you how to cover your face. We're going to tell you to pour milk on your eyes when the gas gets in your eyes, rather than water. Water actually makes it worse. Okay? And so I'm watching the Twitter feed and watching the comments on this from people thousands of miles away. Okay? And we see this in a lot of the different protests now. When we look back stateside at the First Amendment, different presidents, and I think the chapter is quite interesting on discussions with Obama. Obama charged, there were 8 people arrested under the Espionage Act under Obama for leaking and primarily for national security issues. Okay? But the first one was not arrested until after he'd been in office about a year. Trump made it 5 months before the first one was arrested. The difference with the two, the Obama ones tended to be more national security focused, whereas the Trump treatment of journalists were more people who disagreed with him stateside. So it wasn't a national security concern for Trump. And if you think of the high profile individuals under Obama, Chelsea Manning is one, and Edward Snowden, who's still hanging out in Russia. Okay. And so former NSA contractor knows a lot, probably on both the US and Russia, is quite comfortable in Russia. Okay. They will not deport him or extradite him. Okay. And then in terms of how each president has handled the White House, Obama, there was some wiretapping that occurred. The access didn't change though, whereas Trump has actually banned some press reporters from speaking to individuals, and there's been limits on the kinds of questions you can ask. Only certain reporters will get called on, and you'll see the tweets the next day of which reporters he thinks asked bad questions. But overall, the Trump administration has been very confrontational to journalists, and you saw that in those tweets earlier of calling out specific journalists. Particularly if it's a female journalist, you'll see some quite derogatory language that's used. And so things we have not really seen from a president before. And so he's really used this to pronounce policy, whether or not his advisors knew ahead of time, to react to content. And so the other night we learned about his opinions on Alec Baldwin. It took Alec Baldwin. It took years before Obama would even admit his favorite character on The Wire. Whereas now, things like, why is the president tweeting about an actor and an SNL characterization? So we see a wide range of reactions both to policies and to more social events that are happening. So he thought the Oscars were boring. They were kind of dry at parts, but I don't want to agree too much, but it was a little dry in the middle. But things like, we're just seeing a wide range that past administrations really have not commented on this. We see a lot more of the bully pulpit. So things like Rocket Man insulting Sessions and some of the treatment that he's had as Attorney General, Tillerson, Adam Schiff. Yeah, there's Republicans and Democrats, to the point where Republicans are really in a difficult spot in Congress because on the one hand, he's a Republican president and you want to take advantage of having control of the House and the Senate and the administration. But at the same time, he's not really ideological, right? And so he's not going to behave like a traditional Republican because he isn't one. And so it's really created a lot of uncertainty with advisors and members of Congress trying to influence the president in the hopes that he'll influence policy to help them. And then certainly with mobilizing supporters, that when we saw the immigration ban go into place, a lot of comments came out about that, sort of fueling stereotypes that people had about immigrants. When there's an Indianapolis Colts player who was killed a few weeks ago by a gentleman, I believe from Guatemala, who'd been deported several times and come back. And I used to be a big Colts fan, used to have season tickets till they got rid of Peyton, and then I followed him to Denver. So I followed the Colts news pretty often, and my first thought though when I heard that news was he's going to make this an immigration issue because that individual feeds into his narrative that immigrants are dangerous and they bring crime. Okay, we're going to hear a lot of information. DACA expires tonight, one of the latest extensions tonight. So there have been a lot of protests and rallies today. And we're going to hear a lot over the next few days about tweeting over different responses and protests. And the inconsistency also creates a lot of uncertainty. Last thing I want to end with, and I always do this for my classes as well, is to think about what do? You came to this lovely talk, preparing for a couple of good questions, but what do you really do when you leave this room? I think the first is thinking about your sources. There are a lot of ways to check the quality of it because everyone can create a blog or create an article or post something. It doesn't mean they're all good, right? And so really think about where you're getting your information from and maybe thinking about it for a few different sources. So when you see it first on one page, maybe look at a few others to see if it's accurate, right? Look at different ideological perspectives, okay? Some of the best fact-checking websites are PolitiFact.com, factcheck.org, and Snopes. The first two will focus more on politics. And the last one will include some like urban legend kinds of things. And so it's a much wider range on Snopes. Most of the major news outlets now, since the administration, they've added fact-checking offices or staff. So New York Times will have one, Washington Post will have one. So if you watch the State of the Union, or if you go back and watch it now, you can see the comments and then you'll see the correct fact on the other side. So, the US has created more jobs than anyone else. No. The US gives more aid than anyone else in the world. No. Immigrants do all these awful things at the worst numbers ever. No. Every president in every State of the Union will have some exaggerations, and they will be, kind of taking some claims a little too far. Every president does this. We've just never seen it on this scale. And so I think really looking at these sites, and again, I recommended them under Obama as well, so it's not a Trump emphasis here at all. It's just the volume we're seeing now is very different than what we used to have. Congress.gov is where you can go to track legislation. So when you hear any proposed bills in the House or bills in the Senate, if you want to see what Johnson and Baldwin are proposing, especially with Baldwin going up for election this year, you can go to congress.gov, type in her name, and see every legislation she has sponsored, how she has voted. And it's a really good tool for you to then contact her and let her know what you think. Every member of Congress has at least one person who tracks the calls. They track the calls, they track the emails. After the last election, for the first time in my life, I programmed my members of Congress phone numbers in my phone. I used to be more of an email person. I'm right on the edge of that Gen X, Gen Y, where I don't like to talk on the phone too much, especially to people I don't know. But I put them in and I call. We don't have deep conversations. I will call and say, I'm opposed to bill number whatever. And they track it, and that's a way to express my opinion on that. The Federal Register is one you might be a little less familiar with. This is where all of the rules and orders that the agencies pass get proposed. So Congress isn't doing much right now, because can't agree on anything. And so the agencies are passing a lot more rules than you're probably hearing about. This is kind of dry stuff. You're not going to hear about it on the news. One issue we did hear about was the stream protection rule. We've got a lot of beautiful waters in Wisconsin. That stream protection rule puts them at risk. The rule got struck down because now it's not going to require mining companies to clean up some of the waters to a certain standard. Okay? That didn't get voted. None of us voted on that. None of us voted on a congressman that was going to vote on that rule. Okay? It was done through agency procedures. Okay? And so a lot of the policies we're seeing right now, for whatever issue you're passionate about, there's going to be a rule proposed on it. And you can do the same thing. You can comment on that directly on the Federal Register website. And so you'll see academics who upload data reports. You'll see farmers who are commenting on agricultural policy. It's a really powerful tool just to learn about what these agencies are doing. And then the last one really is voting. My Vote Wisconsin will give you information on how to register, where to go. Wisconsin is one of the most difficult voter registration requirement systems in the country. Okay? And so if you have not voted before, or if you know of people who have not voted before, check this out sooner rather than later so you can get the ID required and get that taken care of. But that really is going to be the most powerful way to express your opinion. And I think for the accountability that we want our media to have, that we want our leaders to have, it really starts with that voting and taking that first step to become involved. So. A lot of great resources on how to do that, and I'm sure the League of Conservation Voters has been quite active with that here as well. So with that, open it for questions. Oh, thank you.
I think my voice is loud enough. You said, and lots of other pundits say, we'll probably never know if the trolls, the bots, the fake news, etc., actually swayed the election. Isn't there a viable research project that could do that?
Yeah, and I'm really hopeful we do. But I think it was the State Department, I forget the exact amounts, but there's been money allocated to a number of agencies to investigate this and to develop cybersecurity. A fraction of it has been spent. And that's where more of my skepticism comes in. It's not that we can't figure out. I'm just not sure that those in power right now want to. Because even if it did influence the election, they really don't want that to come out. But just the discussion that the more we talk about Russia, the less we're talking about other policy issues. And so if you don't fund them, from the government level, you limit the conversation. And there's, the chapter mentions a joint project. I believe Facebook and a few other companies are involved in essentially investigating this. And internationally, there's a lot of cybercrime and cyber investigations that are going. So I am hopeful we find out, but at the same time, it's going to be difficult without the political willpower. I can be optimistic on a lot of things. That one.
Just two quick things. If I click on triplomacy.com, will I see different Google ads on the sides of my computer screen or not?
No, let me see. I don't know if I can get it in here. Triplomacy? Let's see if I can get it.
Because I never know if I click on something, I'm going to get some feedback from other types of organizations. No,
this will be, so if you go, taking a little bit to load here. You'll tap on the different continents, and up top you can see, so the social rankings, this will give you the most influential world leaders, most followed world leaders. So not necessarily the same, that you might have someone with a lot of followers, but the influence comes in with the retweets, so how many times someone posts again. And then most connected, so most interactions. But really, I mean, it's global. So if you look at Africa, 81% of the tweets sent by the president are replies, so he's a more conversational world leader as opposed to someone making original comments. So it's a really fun tool. I was not familiar with it until I put this talk together.
And I'm glad you brought up the last slide of your presentation regarding PolitiFact and fact check and things like that, because when I see fact check, I've always thought, who are these people? I mean, are they honest? Do they have their own agenda? I don't know if I can trust their judgment.
And that's a good question. And I think the Washington Post one, I think, has been the most reputable of the. New York Times has gotten itself into a little bit of hot water, which is also why I look at multiple ones. So I would look at both Fact Check and Snopes and PolitiFact for not every issue. No one has that kind of time. But for the issues that are really important or the biggest claims, I think, I'll check multiple sources. And I think that when you see all of the different sources from competing organizations saying it's inaccurate, it gives it more credibility. But no, and that's a good question. You don't automatically trust and believe the fact checkers any more than the media. It's another tool to help make an informed decision. Yep.
How much time do you spend going at all this?
I have my phone about that far away from me most of the time. I'm on it a lot. I primarily use Facebook. I'm not a big fan of Twitter, but I started to feel more of the pressure for Twitter professionally because it's used so much at conferences that I am missing out on research and knowledge that gets shared on Twitter. I do not want to add up the hours in the day. Again, with my 6 animals, I'm going to blame a little bit of it on them because they're really cute. But it's a fair chunk of time. And after the election, it was important to me, I told my students this too, to focus on the issues that are most important to you, that I can't focus on all of the things all the time. So for me, I largely focus on environmental issues and education. So Betsy DeVos is from Michigan, so she's basically been public enemy #1 for a long time. And so that's kind of where I've chosen to allocate my time. So I largely focus on those. I'll be teaching the presidency class this fall. So I'll have to read a lot more of the White House tweets than I would care to normally. But it's time consuming, and it really can be a black hole, especially when you get into checking multiple sources and following the fact check. So more hours than I would care to admit. Yep.
The narrative Republicans have that the media is very liberal, that has been for a long time, probably since 1970s, and it's basically a tactic just to sort of intimidate the press, to kind of like slowly drag into just give the Republican talking points, you know. I mean, the press will say, well, they're accusing us that we are so biased to the Democrat, so then we better start, you know, being more friendly. It's a tactic, basically, and it works, you know. So, for example, in the election, the presidential election, all the free time that Donald Trump gave the press, because, you know, the media, what they care is to make money. So they saw that having Donald Trump is a money making for them. Yep. So of course Republicans get their mouth shut. It's only when, you know, the media is saying lies that W. Bush lies about the war, or the the tax cuts, and that is increasing poverty, then says, there you go, the media is attacking us, so to speak. You know, Now, one thing about what we people outside the Republican world don't understand is that Trump doesn't care about the people who are not Republicans. Everything he does and he said is just to excite the base. And if you listen to Republican voters, but they love him because basically he does represent average Republican voters. If you listen, I mean, all of us know Republicans, you know. No, it's a comment. Yeah. Yeah. Now, one thing is, now is a question. Do you, I'm going to ask a question. Do you know what is the ranking of United States in the about freedom of press? Because I think it's not very good, actually.
You know, I did not look that one up.
I think it's like 23rd or 17, actually.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to double check on that one. I'm not sure on that. And some of that would depend with the measurement too, because with the US, you don't have the physical attacks or the imprisonment that you would see internationally. And so, and we've got, with the First Amendment protections, particularly with journalists, that's going to buffer them from a lot more of the charges that would get you jailed in another country. And so we're higher in terms of accessibility and opportunities for journalists. Where I'm not sure where we would rank is that ownership piece that I mentioned at the beginning. Because there's such a small number of companies that own the media, that could have some influence. I haven't looked at the metrics for the Freedom House in a little while, so I can't tell you exactly how that would affect the ranking. But I think, to your point with Trump's use of mobilizing the base, we're actually seeing really different poll responses with Republicans. That there's a real tension between you have the president on your party in office, but at the same time is advocating policies that are not consistent with the Republican platform. And so, I taught the presidency class during the election, and it was a fantastic group of very open students. And the students who were Republican really struggled because they didn't agree with the sexist comments that were made. They didn't agree with the harassment or with some of the anti-immigrant sentiment, but at the same time, they disagreed with the Democrat platform. Where do you go when you don't fit into one of those boxes? With our system, there's not a box left for you.
And vote Republican. I mean,
they for the most part, they did. Yeah. Yeah, and that they did. More Republicans broke for Trump, whereas more Democrats. Again, it's a myth that they didn't vote because of Bernie. Not true on that one. Democrat turnout overall was not as strong, and they didn't break for anybody, whereas more libertarians and independents, if they were conservative, they did end up kind of going for Trump. But it's tougher, and we're starting to see some of the cracks in the armor. I mean, the fact that Paul Ryan, as Speaker of the House, openly disagreed with Trump today is a huge, huge step. If Mitch McConnell does it, we all need to check our pulses. Okay, so we'll stay tuned on that one.
I don't know if you know how to track this, but I've seen pop-up ads on certain YouTube channels that are promoting the tax cut. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're flashcard things saying, this is how the tax cut is going to help you. And I don't know if they're just targeted to certain YouTube channels, but it seems like the ones where I'm seeing is on the YouTube channels that are off-grid living and things like that. Yep. So it seems like they might be targeting a certain amount of people.
Absolutely.
Is there a way to track that? To find out where they're coming from?
There is. And a lot of that, what they'll do with YouTube is they'll look at the keywords. And so both for the site that it's on and the keywords for whatever, if you're looking at a video or if you're looking at pictures or whatever the site is, there are keywords attached to that. And so you can buy ads. And I mean, the university does this you'll see ads for our graduate program if you're looking at certain environmental websites. Okay, so everybody does this, but with politics, you can target it. So if, for the off-grid living, part of the tax cut narrative has been how it will help people essentially, more independent, less government interference. It feeds into everything that is very important for a lot of the, off-the-grid type of individuals. And so, yeah, you can absolutely look at that. And after the election, there are a lot more metrics to try and dig into that, because the theory is that Russia used and bought some of those ads. So depending on what sites you looked at, then you were going to see ads that would essentially instill more doubt about Clinton or make Trump look more favorable. Yeah. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm filling questions. Go. Oh, sorry.
With the red Wisconsin hat.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just lend a little clarity to this discussion. I'm not liberal or conservative. I would say I'm truly independent. I'm truly an independent. I'm an independent. I'm not.
Most of America really is.
Well, maybe. But the system is not, unfortunately.
True.
Someone once said many, many years ago, there's a little history lesson. This is probably at least 50 years ago or more. He said there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Well, if he's right then, he's more right now. And if you want proof of that, I give you Donald Trump. He was opposed with equal vigor by both the Republican establishment as well as the left. Mm-hmm. Politically, he is an independent populist who pretends to be a Republican, who ran as a Republican. That's what he is. He tapped into hatred and anger, and that's how he won. I don't know whether he'll win again. I hope not, but he's shrewd, he's crafty, and he got enough people to fall for it. When he's with conservatives, he talks like a conservative. When he's with liberals, he talks like a liberal. He's nothing. He's nothing but a showman. I mean, P.T. Barnum, they've compared him to P.T. Barnum. Well, that's what we have as a president now, and I guess we're going to have to somehow live through it. Would you agree?
The Mueller investigation is livening up, so we'll stay tuned on that one. But yeah, I mean, to your point with the ideological challenges, I think where Twitter plays in, he'll have a meeting with the Parkland students, and the comments that he'll say to them, going, oh, I really support this. I'll look into, raising the minimum age, and then he'll have a meeting with the NRA shortly afterwards and tweet and announce something different. Right. And so that's the thing. I mean, we are in a two-party system in terms of our elections and our choices, but we now have a president who doesn't fit in a box, and that's causing a lot of challenges.
Okay, I have a question from someone watching from home. I'm just going to put this out here quick because they've been waiting. What is your basis for the statement that Wisconsin has one of the most difficult voter registration systems in the country? Registration at the polls appears rather easy.
It's with Wisconsin system. There has been. I'm blanking on the name of the organization at the moment, but there are independent voting organizations that will talk about the ID requirements that we have and some of the limitations, particularly for minorities and lower socioeconomic ones, that if you don't have a driver's license, the multiple other forms of ID that may be required can be more challenging to get. The timeline of when you can register to vote is a little bit different. We do have early voting, and that was it's certainly a good step, but as I saw with the campus situation, if students don't early vote to then register on site, you might be in line for several hours. And so there's some logistical challenges with it, but with, again, just the kind of the experts and sort of the voting folks, we are rated as one of the most difficult sites by multiple organizations on that. So I believe New York Times had a pretty good voter background information on that, but if you want to feel free to contact me and I can get you the specific stats and reports on that.
Our congressman said he seemed to be working for the Republicans.
There are concerns in who it's favoring.
One at a time. You have a question up front here? This may not be an answerable question by you, I don't know. Do you think there's any relationship between the narcissism of a political leader and the nationalism or nationalistic tendencies of the country they represent? I
do, and there's a lot. I have a colleague who does fantastic work in political psychology, and that's actually what I planned on going into until 9/11. And when you look at personality traits of leaders, I think there certainly is a connection with the two, that if you are more the narcissist personality, your belief in what you're capable of, your belief in the extent to which people will follow you and believe you, your resilience to facts when they contradict your beliefs, all of that will play in. And we see this with some of the African dictators as well that have also been suspected of having similar personalities personalities. Certainly not having necessarily the resources and capability of the United States, but similar beliefs in their own infallibility and how I can commit war crimes and be immune from prosecution on that. And so I think there's certainly a connection there.
I mean, we certainly saw that in World War II with Hitler,
Yes.
Mussolini,
Yep.
Stalin. I mean, at what point does nationalism become a danger point?
Yeah. And I think, I would think, honestly, the day after the election, I had friends that was a teacher in Detroit. And you may have seen this on the news where there was a white student who stood on the table, built that wall, and yelled at the Hispanic students sitting at the table. That was the morning after the lunch after the election, the next day. And so I think there's a real risk in that type of nationalism. And there's a difference between that kind of nationalism and patriotism. And that's what I think is kind of getting muddied. That, I'm going to guess we're all patriots. We all love this country. We all appreciate the opportunities and privileges we have by being here, right? You look at what's happening in other countries, and other countries don't have all the privileges that we do. We can be patriots and also be concerned about nationalism. And whether it's you look at the citizenship oath that was just changed, and how the lines that was taken out as sort of people from all around the world or something to that effect. A line that recognized the diversity of the country. Nationalism is going to argue that you need to look a certain way, and that if you're not that way and you don't believe that way, then you're not nationalist. You don't love your country. Okay.
It isn't a narcissist going to tend to see the country more as an extension of themselves?
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Recently, Congress got rid of net neutrality. I was wondering what kind of impact that's going to have on social media.
It was one that I did not know much about until the debate came out on the public. And so that was a steep learning curve. Basically, with net neutrality, it's sort of an equal access, right? So you don't pay more for certain speeds. You don't pay more for access, okay? So it keeps it all a level playing field. My expectation is that Congress would overturn the FCC. I think there's enough momentum to do that. But if they don't overturn net neutrality and it's gone, you will pay more for faster internet speeds. So it will change the kind of content you can access. It will change the access themselves. Maybe you can't afford to go. It will cost the library more for certain websites and to cover the media services here, right? So for people who are any kind of access, it can make more expensive. And when you make something more expensive, you can use those services. And it really will prioritize some kinds of outlets. And so if you're having to pay more to get your message out, we're going to see different kinds of messages. So it's concerning, but it's also, we're not going to see really net neutrality protests and rallies and hashtags. So it's kind of a tough one to get people fired up about, but has a huge impact on how we are accessing media and what we can do. And it'll be interesting to see, for sites like Instagram and Twitter, where those are not terribly dependent on speed. Twitter's free. You can all put Twitter on your phone. You can all look at Facebook. But what if you want to fact check a tweet you saw? That's going to be more problematic.
I have a quick question, then this gentleman. As the librarian, knowing that this county has pockets where there's no access to the internet, is this not going to create a fourth world country? And, our discrimination against people who are poor, or I come from Milwaukee, the inner city, aren't we putting people in a down position now?
I think it depends, and I think I'll use my actually both of my grandmothers as examples on this. On my paternal grandmother, she was never online, never used a computer in her life. She would watch the news and she would read the paper so consistently. So she's not necessarily hearing a lot of different perspectives, but she probably knew the current events better than some of my students when they're taking a class. And so I think that you're still paying for the newspaper delivery, but I think for rural communities, it's a different, access looks a little bit different, but it can also be shaped by the content of whatever that local paper is. So if it's a more conservative local paper, you're going to see conservative views on that. More liberal paper, same kind of thing. I think the interstate is a different question. I think with that, some of the kinds of issues, and that's where I think we look at the support the schools have and the resources that schools have, that if your school has a library, if you have teachers that are encouraging, engagement and going to protests or going to talks like this, I think that you can address some of that deficit gap. And if anyone's read the book Hillbilly Elegy, really, really powerful book. It's a gentleman who was in rural West Virginia and sort of talks about how he grew up in this rural community with exactly the access issues you mentioned, and sort of how he overcomes that to ultimately, I think it was Harvard or Duke. And so he, is it Yale? Oh, for 3, Yale, sorry about that. I love the book, bad on school names, but it's sort of how he overcame those obstacles. And I think it's on, really all of us to help, the community sense and thinking about providing that access, providing the resources, whether that's computers in the library, whether that's newspapers, whether that's talks that are free to attend. I think there are ways to address that, but there certainly is going to be a differential. And I see that with some of my students who don't have internet at home. So their ability to do research. Do they look at the first site because they only have an hour on campus before they commute to their job? Or do they look at those 5 sites to make sure they're getting reputable, trustworthy information? So I even see that in the higher ed environment where there's going to be a differential there. My parents are both public school teachers, so I try to be optimistic.
I believe that you're giving out some information and it is subtly misleading. For example, you mentioned students in your class who were Republicans, but are split over certain opinions. You said, like, for example, they don't believe in harassing immigrants.
No, sexual harassment and immigrants separate.
That's what you said. They don't believe in harassing immigrants.
No.
I'm a Republican. What Republicans believe in harassing immigrants?
That's not what I said.
I'd like to know who. What did you say then?
I suspect it was the Midwest mumbling them together. I was talking about perceptions of immigrants because of the immigration ban and sort of the Mexicans as rapists comment, and sexual harassment of women, separate issues. Those students in my class were really upset, particularly the female student, who, when she watched the candidate that she was working on the campaign, she was working on the Trump campaign, really struggling with her candidate making derogatory comments about women. That was a personal struggle for her. I watched one of my students who has immigrant friends and family from Mexico saying, listen, my family and my friends are not rapists, and my candidate, and this presidential candidate, accused Mexicans of being rapists, accused immigrants of only coming to commit crimes. They struggled with those issues. Okay? We had those discussions in my class.
That's not what I inferred from what you said.
What she has said repeatedly is that they were 2 separate issues.
Yeah, but
I believe we should probably move on to another question because it's been addressed.
You're going to.
So 1 second.
Thank you for your question.
I just have one comment, I think, not just for here, but
Sure.
are we sometimes, when we speak of immigrants, forgetting the adjective illegal?
That's a good question. And I think with, and this is one area that Obama was not the best at either in terms of deportations and immigration raids, and Democrats were not vocal about that. They were not vocal about criticizing that. I think for me the question, and I think DACA is a good example, or Dreamers are a good example, that you want to deal with illegal immigration. Every country in the world wants to address that. But I think there's also, it's not as black and white as that. So I think, again, DACA Dreamer kids are a good example. When you've got kids who have come here at a young age, have been raised in the US, and came through no fault of their own, technically illegal, but should they be? Can we come up with a better way to help them? Again, you'll hear the path to citizenship language used. I think that that's, quite honestly, more of a productive discussion that, we've seen talks and media stories about doctors who've been here for 20, 30 years getting deported. Now, personally, I don't think you have to be a doctor or this rocket scientist to be worthy of being an American. But those are the cases we're hearing about as a way to bring attention to more complicated immigration cases. And so I think it's one question to be concerned about illegal immigrants and be concerned about crime and be concerned about who is coming into the country. From a safety perspective, absolutely. We want to know who's coming in. We want to know if they had possible terrorist ties. And this is an area that, again, I've educated myself on a bit more recently. I had one student from Somalia, and I had never really talked to him about how difficult it is to come to the US. That even at the refugee camp stage, the vetting that they go through is extensive. It is far more difficult to come to the US than most of us have realized. And so I'd rather see that conversation over how to better vet people and help them come to the US than just shut down immigration completely because we're scared. So I think there's a little bit different issues on that.
I've got a follow-up on the question on access a couple minutes ago. You were commenting about how local newspapers might have their own focus or bias for certain people. My concern is that it doesn't seem to me we have local newspapers anymore. In Manitowoc, our local newspaper was bought up by Gannett, who owns everything else in Wisconsin, I think now. And we have no local editorial at all. We have very little local reporting. Our local stories usually come from Wausau, Appleton, Green Bay, and most of the rest of the news is also in the Milwaukee Journal. And so there is no local influence. It's all one company. And it's not Comcast.
Yeah.
I don't know if Comcast does much editorial. It's Gannett.
Yeah, and my hometown's about 7,000 people, and we actually do still have a local paper. It's still actually printed. But that's a big challenge that we're seeing print journalism really die out. And, you know, you used to have family members who worked for newspapers, and it's simply a more challenging industry as they're going to digital-only options, that they might not even be printing it. And so I think that's a big challenge going forward. And it's a question of who fills that void. You know, are you going to the library to get your news? What about transportation concerns? You know, I don't have any good answers on that one other than, like I said, I come from no shock to any of you now, a politically active family from a young age. My first campaign was when I was 12. And so, no, I worked for the campaign. I'm not running. Teaching's enough. But I think that a lot of it, the community that I was in had opportunities. And so I think particularly for the smaller towns, having a series like this is a really good opportunity. But there's still access issues. You all had to drive here. Maybe some of you walked, but you had to get here somehow. And so my grandmother was 99 and a half. She wasn't going to be traveling much. And so it was more difficult for her to become informed, or for a friend who had a kid fighting cancer. They're not going online. They're not reading newspapers. And so I think we have to get better about communicating that information. And as much as I love social media, and my phone is really about that far away from me most of the time, it can't be the only tool that we use. And I think we're sort of headed in that direction. And the pendulum will swing back. We'll get other options, but we're not there yet.
You also have talk radio. Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin.
Yeah.
Don't forget about those two.
Yeah. Yeah, no, radio brings up a really good question. I did not include that. So to the access point, that'd be one. You know, we can all have transistor radios and radio access most places. That's an interesting one, especially with some of the podcasts too, because you can listen again on your phone or with your AM, FM radio, and they're not really fact-checking those sometimes either. And you can certainly find, I listened to a podcast driving down here today, actually. So you can certainly find those types of news sources that will confirm your beliefs as well. The polls that I included in here didn't specifically ask about radio. That in a lot of the media surveys that I have looked at, it doesn't poll as high as a source that people use for news. They'll listen to it for music. They'll listen to it for kind of like your NPR story time sorts of projects. For most of the polls that I've looked at anyway, it's not used as much for news as it could be. But I bet if you slice it out to ask rural populations, I would bet you see more of the rural communities using it more for news. But that's good speculation on my part. Oh, sorry. I'll stop fielding questions.
I would just like to say that We are very fortunate here to this group to have the Herald Times reporter consistently this year report on what is happening here, and just
that's great.
Are extremely appreciative, because we know that the staff is not where it used to be, and the coverage is not as good for things, but it still is doing a remarkable amount of reporting on local things, and we appreciate this very much.
It's good to have.
Good job. Good job. I just want to ask a question that maybe those what do students learn in grammar school and high school about the process? Sorry.
No, you're good. I just edited some papers the other night, so the grammar part got me.
Sorry. Well, do kids, when I taught undergraduates, there were debates in my class about how many U.S. senators there were. That made me nervous.
Yes.
So what is civics a requirement? Is American government a requirement? Do students in Wisconsin need to learn something basic?
K-12 I'm not as familiar with, because I've only taught in the higher ed system here. There's certainly AP government. More schools have AP courses, so I would assume that there's some sort of requirement on that. With Green Bay, you do have to, either you have to comp out of American government if you've taken AP, or that is most likely one of the prerequisite classes you're going to take. I taught it once. Hopefully that is the only time I will teach American government. But with teaching global politics, which I do in the fall, I was surprised at the number of students who were not aware that Puerto Rico is part of the US. But nationally, that's the same nationally. Less than half the country realizes that Puerto Rico is part of the US. And so I think of how, I went to a pretty good high school, public school, small town, but I think of how much I learned when I got to college. I didn't know about countries, again, from this really small, really white hometown. And so I was not exposed to the kind of diversity that I learned about in college. And so I don't necessarily fault kids for not knowing, but it certainly puts a bigger challenge on everyone in higher ed when you come in and there's not necessarily that basic understanding. And I like to have them try and take the citizenship test, which most US citizens actually can't pass. So if you have to name the 13 colonies, and again, the members of Congress or numbers of senators and representatives, and details that if you've seen anyone go through the citizenship process, they will know American government better than probably most of us in the room, and that's my degree, is political science. And so there's a disconnect somewhere, and I think the bigger picture with public schools not getting enough funding and not getting enough resources, that tends to be a class that stays, but how well it's taught, how diverse it's taught. States like Texas will have their own Texas American history books, which I didn't think was a real thing until I started teaching. And then there's Texas publishers, so there'll be an American government edition of what I would use, and there will be a separate Texas edition of the same American government book. Okay. And so even publishers are shaping the content when you get to college. So I think I'm not seeing students coming in with as much background awareness, but I'm not sure how much of that is I'm in a public institution that draws from the county versus the kind of private school that I went to for college.
The reason I ask the question is it seems quite unreasonable to expect people who complete high school without learning any of this to come to a forum like this, to trudge to the library in the snow to read a newspaper because they don't have access to the internet.
It's tough on them.
And
yeah.
So there's some responsibility to move this information down 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
Oh, okay, I would like to ask a question. My question is this. There is a media station that you can turn on every evening in your home, and it starts out with the announcer, I won't say whatever gender, keeping them honest. And then they go into this long dissertation, and obviously it's usually about the events of our president that have occurred. So are we supposed to, is he keeping us on it? Are they keeping us honest? Are they, are there things correct, or do we have to fact check that too?
You know, I'm not familiar with that particular program, so I can't comment on kind of the reputability with that one. But I think, and I'll use Rachel Maddow as one example. She's really popular in liberal circles. I'm actually not her biggest fan because I don't think she's necessarily as thoughtful as I would like. She's a little more reactive in the same way that Republicans get criticized for being reactive. But I admire her passion about politics. And so if I'm watching someone like Rachel Maddow, I'm not going to watch Fox News, I'll be honest there. The factual inaccuracies that get published are a little higher for Fox News as compared to some other networks. But if I hear something on Rachel Maddow that just seems a little off, yeah, I'm absolutely going to PolitiFact or to some of the other ones, even if it's someone that I would share a similar ideology with. And so, but that's also important for me that I want to understand not only the perspective, but why they think the way they do. And so I think, if you're looking at Anderson Cooper is another one, or Wolf Blitzer. Anderson Cooper used to be on Channel 1 when I was a kid in middle school, so he is near and dear to my heart from a young child age. So I'm not terribly objective. When he talks about something, I'm not the most objective, and so for someone that I know I'm going to have blinders on, yeah, I'm going to look at what they're saying a bit more clearly. But those shows are a good opportunity. If you watch Meet the Press, and you can get past Chuck Todd's attitude on life. No one is Tim Russert, all right? Tim Russert was the best. Yes. Own that one. But I think I like those kinds of shows because Chuck Todd will push the Democrats, he will push the Republicans, and he will ask them tough questions. And so I like watching those kinds of shows to hear the debate. And then if it's an issue that I want to know more about, I'll go look it up.
I just want to interject for a minute here. I just had it verified. In the state of Wisconsin, and it's now a law that no student can graduate without passing the civics test. So here in the state, and for anybody that doesn't know, we do have a little corner down on the first floor that has our civics corner. So if you ever want to go down and see the flashcards that are used to learn to pass the test, we do have that, and we have a video. Am I missing anything, Linda, on that?
No, it's the citizenship test, though. It's a citizenship corner as opposed to a civics corner. But when you see what people have to know who do not speak English as their native language, and the questions that they have to memorize, you will be awed. I've seen two people through the citizenship test.
So if you ever want to know, just ask for thank you, Linda, I always forget the name, I apologize, but to see our citizenship, it's the blue wall down in the corner. So thank you, sorry.
Good resource.
Sandra Day O'Connor, in her retirement from the Supreme Court, has made it her life's work to ensure that every child, whether grade school, middle school, high school, does not end their education, their pre-college education, without passing a civics or good government course. That is what she is spending her time doing since she retired from the Supreme Court.
Wow, very cool.
It is very cool, and it's not a question. I'm just saying that as a point of information.
Yeah, well, she's someone that she's kept a very low profile. She retired early, which is very unusual for Supreme Court justices, largely in concern for her husband's health at the time, wanting to take care of him, and it's exciting to hear that she's done it. Ginsburg's going to stay there forever. She's not going anywhere. But it's really neat when you hear some of that under the radar advocacy, and President W. Bush has actually done quite a bit of sort of advocacy, and we'll wait and see what the Obamas do with their post-president life. But it's a powerful tool because she's going to have a really unique platform for engaging people at very high levels of policy, and hopefully can get more of that pushed through. So it's good to hear. Any other questions? I feel like there were a lot at once in the last round there. Oh. We're going to get kicked out soon. Go for it.
I'm just curious what town of 7,000 you're from.
Marshall, Michigan. Okay. Home of Schuler's bar cheese.
Home of the Honolulu House.
And the Honolulu House, yes. Sorry, really excited about my hometown. The shoelace bar cheese was a real point of pride until I came to Wisconsin, and then they're going, "Oh, that's cute. You think your cheese is special." Like, well, I did till I came here, but now we have Myers. We're in Green Bay, where you can get the shoelace bar cheese, so it feels like a little bit of home. Yeah, you should all Google the Honolulu house. Funny story, but it really was designed after this house in Honolulu. So there's pineapples all over. It's the town symbol. I even worked there for a summer too, and I remember none of the history. It did not stay well. Everybody gets their pictures there, prom pictures, wedding pictures. Beautiful fountain with a roundabout that has one lane, as opposed to the very strange Wisconsin multi-lane thing we have here. So, yeah, Marshall, Michigan. So.
This isn't a question, but I promised someone they could make an announcement of significance at the end or towards the end.
Sure.
So I'm turning the microphone over.
Okay.
Okay. The Sheboygan County Historical Research Center has a program once a month on usually some aspect of Sheboygan County history. This Saturday's program will be the 75th anniversary of the USS Kobaya, and it'll be done by Matthew Cato from the Maritime Museum. Starts at 9:30. It's in Plymouth, Wisconsin at the Art Center, and that address is 520 East Mill Street. Get there early, get free coffee and donuts.
All right. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank you very much. See you next week. Drive safe. It looks fine out there as of right now. Thank you.
I'm from Jackson, just down the road, and I first went to, my grandpa lived in Marshall, first went to the Honolulu house just 4 or 5 years ago, and I loved the, I don't know how it's pronounced, Trump.